Set? Okay. The topic for this week is the end of the classical romantic era. I'm putting classical and romantic together because the two of them, even though they're quite different in a lot of ways, we've talked about the differences, use much the same tonality, even though Romanticism is taking it in a new direction. At the beginning of the 20th century, something radical changes. And so we're going to see how that change happens. And the way we'll do it this week is by looking at 3 different love stories. The first one is by Richard Wagner. And he is sort of the ultimate romanticist, the composer who takes the idea of love into a spiritual dimension, much like Snow White takes the beauty of Snow White into a spirit, understands that totally in spiritual terms. Richard Wagner takes the love of Tristan and Isolde, and that's the name of the opera as well, to a point where, for a moment at least, their love is beyond all earthly things. Now, of course, it doesn't stay there, and that's the tragedy of the piece. We'll talk more about that in a moment. The second piece we'll look at is by Richard Strauss, another Richard, we would say, of course. A little later, after the turn of the century, and it's Der Rosenkavalier. And the Rosenkavalier means a cavalier is somebody at the court, a knight, a count, somebody who is well versed in the social niceties of the society, and Rose is just a rose. We'll show you what that means in a bit. It's an invention of the librettist. Hello, of the librettist, but is that? Oh, Wolfgang Wagner, look at that. I saw him once outside the theater, by the way. He was giving an interview and I just walked by. That's a different issue. So, and he is the grandson of Richard Wagner, the guy that, so, but, you know, enough of the personal stuff. Then the final one will be from the 20th century by Igor Stravinsky, a Russian composer, and it's called A Soldier's Tale. I'm doing, well, this one is easy to understand. Rosenkavalier really doesn't translate. A Soldier's Tale was written in French. He was in Paris at the time. But, and that is from 1918. Now, as we move through the 19th century from Romanticism, we're going to find that Richard Strauss started as a Romanticist. In fact, he was heavily influenced by Wagner. And this, the height of Romanticism, both in terms of storytelling and in terms of musical composition. And he wrote that way for a while. But he found, by the time that he was writing Rosenkavalier, he found himself bothered by the fact that this artwork, this body of art that was this late Romantic style, was more and more removed from society, as you might expect, right? Snow White is removed from society, Tristan and Isolde are removed from society almost totally, and finally they both die in the end, of course. And this, he wanted some kind of, he felt that that style had reached an end point, that we couldn't go further with it, we needed something new. And his Rosenkavalier is a charming piece, funny, delightful, a little sad, a little uplifting at the same time. But it expresses in a couple of ways that I'd like to show you a crisis of style. A crisis, and it wasn't just the composers, it wasn't just him, and it wasn't just composers. It was artists, literary people, even politicians started to feel this kind of tension. And we'll see that in a number of ways. And this is Vienna at the turn of the century, of the 20th century, around 1900. This is actually a little bit later than that. And Igor Stravinsky, A Soldier's Tale, is an attempt to create something new, to use parts of the musical language in new combinations to create, or to start to create a new sense of musical possibilities. Stravinsky, we're going to find, is one 20th century attempt to do that. We're going to look at a couple more, and one of the more important other versions of a new attempt at musical language in the 20th century is by a guy named Schoenberg. We'll see him in 2 weeks. So, let's begin with a little bit of Tristan and Isolde, and I'd just like to give you a sense of it's sort of a heavy sense, a sense of ambiguity, a sense of beautiful music, but a very long, drawn-out, about as romantic as it gets. And this very first chord, as a matter of fact, as a famous chord in the history of music, you study it when you study music, for example. You study this chord, this opening form, 3 measures, because it's so ambiguous, it's so undefined, it's so romantic. And something about it that is unresolvable, it seems. And Wagner was brilliant at this sort of thing. So I'm just going to play a little bit of the beginning. Listen for that opening, and then there's a long silence, and then it repeats a little higher, and then it's a long silence, and repeats again. And then out of this tapestry grows a melody, which gets a technical term, actually, in the history of music, the ewige Melodie, the eternal, the unending melody. It feels as if it just never ends. Remember, a classical melody goes like this, has an antecedent and a consequent, it's symmetrical, it feels like it's contained, right? The emotion is contained within a form. This one, it's as if all containment has lost, and this cello melody just goes on, and it's gorgeous. I'll talk a little bit about that, a similar thing a little bit later if you've seen the movie Platoon. The music in Platoon is actually by Samuel Barber, but it does something very similar. It just keeps moving on. It feels like it's about to end, and then it doesn't. It goes a little farther. That's what Wagner was after, and I think Barber was probably imitating that. Let's start now with the beginning of this. I think it's loud enough to pick up on the machine, but if it's not, this is also on your content area, so this is now the beginning. The entire opera is on here. You don't have to listen to it. It's 4.5 hours long, and not much happens in it dramatically, but I'll give you a rundown of that in a moment. expect it to end there, but it doesn't. Very much like we've heard in Schubert's Earl King, in the Ghost in Don Giovanni, these repetitions keep getting higher and higher. It's as if it lifts it emotionally, but it doesn't end. It doesn't round it off. Right? It just kind of raises it. So I'm going to call it now for a moment. A little bit about the storyline. King Mark is the king of, I forget where his homeland is, but the opening scene starts with one of his knights named Tristan, who has gone to Wales, I believe it is, or to Ireland, I forget where, to pick up the queen, or a princess, who is going to become the queen and is going to marry his uncle and his king, Mark. The problem is that Tristan has run into someone who was close to Isolde before. I forget exactly what the relationship to Isolde was, and has killed him. And Isolde, so then gets, Tristan dutifully picks her up and takes her on board, and she recognizes him as the man who killed her beloved or her close family member. I forget exactly what the relationship was. And on the boat ride, the return to King Mark's territory, Isolde decides to kill Tristan and takes a bottle of poison and proposes that it's wine, and gives it to him, and he drinks it, and then she drinks the rest, trying to kill herself. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, Isolde's handmaid had switched the bottles, and this was a love potion. And so when they look into each other's eyes after having drunk this, they are hopelessly, romantically, so to speak, in the German romantic sense, in love. In other words, beyond all measure, beyond all earthly boundaries. And of course, it's a love that can't be fulfilled in the world. Look at this. I mean, she is betrothed to the king, and it's Tristan's job, so to speak, to bring her to the king. Well, it doesn't turn out that way, so she does marry the king, but this affair goes on, and so this hopeless, really impossible love becomes more and more powerful, partly because of its impossibility, partly because of the magic, supposedly, that was involved in it, and also partly because Wagner is hinting that this magic may not be magic at all. It may be just the way love is. It's something that's beyond all earthly measure. Right? That's the romantic lead on it. Of course, it's not a classical notion. So what you hear here in the prelude to this piece, and of course you can see that this is a romantic landscape, right? There's nothing there. It's kind of like the Abbey graveyard in the snow without the abbey and without the graveyard and without anything. It's just what the Germans love to call a Totenlandschaft, a landscape of death, perfect for this kind of a storyline in which really the earthly world has nothing to offer, and only the spiritual love has. There's the climax of the piece is in the second act, where Tristan and Isolde have found a love grotto right, which is removed from the world. A grotto is basically a cave, right, and they live basically on love, right? They don't eat, they don't sleep, they just are in love. And it's this sort of spiritual dimension, it's a transcendent love that is beyond all things. Well, they can't stay there, of course, and so eventually Tristan is betrayed and wounded with a poisoned sword, somehow ironic, considering how all this started. And the only one who can save him is Isolde, who in the meantime is in another place. And they take him by boat to see Isolde, who is supposed to cure him, but he dies before she can save him. And the final scene is her mourning over his body and then dying very simply of a broken heart when she dies basically of love. And so this transcendence at the end is really the only transcendence that is ultimately possible, is the transcendence of death. A little bit like Romeo and Juliet, star-crossed lovers. That hint of Romeo and Juliet is a little bit there too, but of course Shakespeare has his feet a little more firmly on the ground than Wagner does. So that's the story of Tristan and Isolde. And you can see how it's a romantic tale, right? It's something that takes you beyond the physical world. But now let's listen to the music for a moment, and I'd like to play just for a moment with the two things that you've already heard. We're not going to go deeply into the opera. It's a study that it takes a certain amount of patience and I think practice. But a couple of things we can pull out, and one is the opening chord that I told you about, and the other. I used to know how these things work. Let's see. The other is a melody. And we've talked about classical harmonies a little bit. We've talked about romantic harmonies, and this is about the ultimate romantic harmony. Remember, if you want to think about it, classical harmony, you would think about a triad, right? 1, 3, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The chord that begins this piece is nothing like that at all. It sounds like this. And you can tell the difference pretty clearly, right? Right, so. Right. And that's quite literally in music history called the Tristan chord. And it's supposed to express this longing. And now Wagner introduces it and resolves it without actually it doesn't resolve it like this. So it leads into it like this. And you can tell, I mean, it moves from an unresolved chord, this, to another unresolved chord, which is this. And this sense of a chord that just kind of hangs in midair harmonically, right? It goes somewhere, but it doesn't go home. It just kind of lifts a little higher. And then he repeats that thing a little higher than that, which goes like this. And then he does it again, right? And you basically got the idea. So this chord, this Tristan chord, we could talk about how, and people, try to analyze it. Is it a da-da-da? Is it a we don't need to do that. All we need to do is have a sense that this is the ultimate romanticism. And throughout this 4.5 hours of music, this unresolved feeling continues, and you can feel that in the melody too. This what now becomes called an eternal melody, an endless melody, because the melody doesn't end, not only because it just keeps going, but because it does something very similar that this harmony does. It feels like it doesn't stay in one tonal area. It just kind of starts lifting, just like the second of these little motifs lifted a little from the first. And so the cellos start this out with, let's see if I can find the melody, where did it go? Oh yeah, here it is. never ends, right? And it's always lifting up a little higher, and lift up like the ghost in Dungeon Money, like the boy in the Earl King. But this sense that the melody is just drawing on into eternity, that it never closes off, that too is Romanticism. It's an astounding piece of music, actually, and it's astounding accomplishment compositionally. It's an advanced listen, obviously, but I've got the entire opera up there on the content area. Obviously, you're not going to listen to the whole thing, but you might want to listen, spot check here and there, just to listen to the sound of the music. A couple minutes here, a couple minutes there. At the very end, the only time this really, 4.5 hours later, ever resolves is at the very end. You hear this again. And then finally, that's 4.5 hours later. And that's the very ending. And that A major, is really a resolution that is not allowed for 4.5 hours. That's the strangest thing. And yet he makes this thing. I've seen this on stage twice, once in Chicago and once in Germany. And you think, you go in there thinking, okay, I'm going to steal, gird your loins, it's going to be 4.5 hours. But it does really go fairly quickly, which is remarkable because nothing happens in the bloody thing. There's really not much of a story. There's it's a welcome relief when Tristan gets mortally wounded because there's a little drama going on. But I think the moment when they're in the love grotto, that's a good 45 minutes. But musically, it is astounding. I mean, if you can get into the sound of the harmonic shifts and this endless song, it really is as if you're in a trance for a while. That's what he's after. So that's a love story that is at the height of Romanticism. Okay. How much time have we put on the? About 10 minutes.
Probably 15.
Let's stop it for a moment, and we have one clip at 15 minutes.